So can you start by telling us your name, current position, and institutional affiliations?
Well, I'm John Campbell. I'm a professor emeritus at the University of Memphis. Other than that, I'm supposedly retired, and I serve on the local school board.
Can you tell me a little bit about some of your most recent research related to the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine?
Well, the most recent I sort of fell into because of where I live in Washington State. I live on a beautiful body of water called Hood Canal. It's not really a canal, it's a glacier that was dug 10 to 13,000 years ago. And it's the only fjord in the lower 48 states. We have a problem with low oxygen. And every once in a while, there will result from this a fish kill. And we're interested, citizens are interested in what we can do to avoid these. Part of it is, of course, the birth defect of all fjords. They're narrow at the mouth, they don't fully flush, and they're subject to these fish kills. And so such things occur other parts in the world. So it is right across Highway 106 from me. I actually have a postage stamp piece of property on the water. Nations have gone to war for less. And I swim in it year-round using a wetsuit. So I kind of literally fell into my project because people are interested in the health of their environment, and I was certainly interested in the health of mine. So I have done one article with my colleague Keith Benson, who's a historian of science, on citizen science using the coalition of citizens and scientists that have done research as to the causes of low dissolved oxygen in Hood Canal as the basis. So I've got one little case study out of that, and I'm thinking of doing another. I also hope to continue on with my Darwin work, and I'm making some progress in that, but my school board activities and other things have opened some new horizons to me that I have not said no to.
It doesn't sound like you're very retired.
The reports of my retirement are greatly exaggerated.
What drew you initially to research the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine?
Lack of preparation when I went in to see my PhD advisor. So for futurity, I would say, never go unarmed into that good interview. I had finished my comps, and I went into Ed Black's office, and he was my thesis advisor, author of Rhetorical Criticism, Study and Method. And I said, Ed, what should I do for my dissertation? And he said to me, well, why don't you do a rhetorical analysis of the origin of species? It's never been done. Well, let me tell you why, but that's another story. So I came into my topic by accident.
What can you tell me about the history of ARST and your involvement with it? And do you recall any memorable moments from past ARST meetings that you'd like to preserve here?
I can't fully vouch for the accuracy of my memory. It may be the case that when I was president the first time in the late 90s, I think we may have had, under my watch, our first pre-conference. I could be mistaken about that, and so I'll be interested in learning whether that was so. But it was certainly one of the earlier ones, and that would have been in the late 90s. I can't remember whether it's 96 or 98, maybe 98. It was in Chicago. We had coffee in the room, as we did today. I remember carefully orchestrating things so that we all ate lunch together, and I actually marched people down. You know, we didn't have to have a parade permit, but I actually marched people to the restaurant, which I'd called weeks before to make a reservation for. And then, do you know anything about Chicago? I cannot remember the name of this famous German restaurant that we had. It was not too far from the hotel where we were having it, and I marched everybody to that hotel, you know, where we had a great, dinner meeting. And so the camaraderie was one of the things that I think has been characteristic of ARST from an earlier time. And to build a sense of community was certainly one of the things that I did. We had two conferences that are now kind of been controversial in memory, one under my watch and one under somebody else's, where we had a panel we had intelligent design representatives talking, and we had people, arguing with them and about the thing. I thought it was great to be able to have people there who were of a minority persuasion, but who also were very competent. These are people that have PhDs, talking about their perspectives, and for our people not to have paper targets, but to have actual human beings to talk to and to converse with about why they think the way they did. And then we had another one on climate change, and the topic is something we're still talking about today, though I think we would be a little gun-shy today for repeating either of those events. I'm not sure that I think I do look back on those days with a certain nostalgia, in that we had the freedom to decide whose company we were to keep. Partially, perhaps, that was in the knowledge that nobody was watching. I think that today, as we have grown in stature, we are more careful of who we invite to our meetings. There is a positive side to that, but I also think there's a certain insouciance, a certain freedom. Devil may care attitude that I think has been part of our identity and I would hate to see lost.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on the gun shyness there? Is that because of a change in academic culture? Or
we are on the verge, and I think many of our members have crossed the line into being people of real stature. And I think that our subdiscipline, we still have subdiscipline, that may change. It might be, who knows what is possible. We were a very small group of people that began by studying the rhetoric of science. I was advised against it by one of my advisors at the University of Pittsburgh when I wanted to take some courses in the history of science. My interest was labeled dilettantism. I dare say that is not the case today. I'm so delighted at this meeting that the University of British Columbia, just north of where I live, they have now a program, a doctoral and master's program in the rhetoric of science. So I was delighted, to see that. And with that stature comes a certain self-awareness and a certain guardedness about how others see us. And I just think that is part of, and as I talk to other rhetoric of science scholars who are dealing with controversial issues that involve non-science, that is frowned upon, would like to be marginalized and silenced by professional scientists, well, how do you maintain an identity as scholars where part of what you're discussing is what the professional scientists want to have silenced? I think that's a very delicate issue of the kind that rhetoricians have often found themselves in, in history. And so, but it's a new world because people now there's a larger audience for our scholarship, and we have interests in building and maintaining a certain kind of identity. And I realize that may constrict in certain ways the sorts of panels we would want to feature and the certain kind of guests we would like to invite.
So ARST is celebrating its 20-year anniversary. Yeah. What significant tensions or intellectual sticking points stand out for you at this moment, looking back over 20 years of the field?
Well, I think immediately just the very idea of the rhetoric of science. I can remember the first course that I taught in the rhetoric of science at the University of Washington. Somebody said, I think it was a philosophy professor of the prospectus that I had, well, this is fine as long as he doesn't talk about the truth of any of this. And the casual dismissal of my own interest as a graduate student as dilettantism, and I started at the University of Washington in 1968, and the courses I was designing were in the 1970s. The hangover from positivism was in the air. Scientism was still a defining feature of the university. And so the very idea of a rhetoric of science seemed either dilettantish or to denigrate the very dignity of science itself. And I think our meeting, particularly today, our 20th anniversary meeting, has really signaled for me a sea change in our studies. The rhetoric of science is no longer news. And I think that's very important. The epistemic wars stemming from Kuhn's, famous book are basically over. And in a non-triumphal sense, I think we are among the victors. We are not, but this becomes a very careful matter for discrimination. We are not among the victors if you mean we are technical science students that think science has been cut down to size or socially deconstructed. As one who likes to think of himself as in the civic tradition of rhetoric, I think the rhetoricity of science is something very important. It needs to be regarded as a fact among other facts, and it needs to be seen as part of what makes science serious rather than something that makes it superficial or trivial. It needs to be seen as one of the things that makes science parallel with, in its audience sphere, what takes place in representative government. And I think that we're on the threshold of a new definition of the meaning of rhetoric, its relationship to science, and the meaning of both of those things for what public deliberation can mean in an era that is increasingly defined by science and technology and medicine, and in which everyone has an opinion, everyone feels entitled to it, and we have a cultural tradition from self-government that affirms that. How, in this circumstance, can we create an environment where people will understand what differentiates some of the criteria that identifies good science, serious science, from what we call junk science? So how can we maintain representative government which affirms the rhetoricity of science, also its professionalism and integrity, and also robustly affirms representative government? These are not issues that can be settled by a formula. They're issues that will be settled by performance. And I really see the upcoming group of case studies as central for the future of our subdiscipline that may someday become a regular discipline.
Can you talk a bit about what you see as your biggest contribution to the field of rhetoric of science, and perhaps connect that a bit to some broader themes in the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine?
Well, I think most of my contribution has been with my Darwin work. I think that the special book on hermeneutics and science that Gross and Keith put out some years ago, in which my work was featured as a kind of a poster child for what was wrong with the entire enterprise, is one of the things that I take a certain pride in. If I am going to be an example, and if someone wants to pick me as a bad example, I take a certain pride in that I represented, I believe, what was an important coming out of our subspecialty. And it was a coming out in which the rhetorical tradition its terminology, its sense of itself as a civic presence, had a certain face-off with a kind of postmodernism that was also post-political, that did not take seriously the public sphere, and that saw anything that was not demonstrative as irrelevant or ephemeral, and challenged the very idea that a rhetorical terminology developed over centuries for the education of citizens in republics or democracies could in any way inform the technical discourse of the modern period, or the late modern period, or the postmodern period. We are no longer talking about the chief instigator of that critique. All the papers at this conference have used the language of the rhetorical tradition or of Kenneth Burke, and as we move into new areas such as visual rhetoric, we're asking what exactly our language is to be. And yet we find still in circulation the topics, metaphor, style, and the importance of bringing together these things that modernity has pushed apart, and in part in the rhetorical tradition itself has distinguished, how style and argument equally are substantive, that the figures are not just decorative, but as David Depew and John Line have pointed out in their paper today, and also as my colleague Larry Prelli has pointed out, these things really do conceptual work in science. So the short answer is this coming of age. I really think we see now that we have an educational and civic responsibility to defend science, to recognize that its rhetoricity is not a reason for demeaning it, but that in fact it represents the argued processes of inquiry. That when you call a gene selfish, it has consequences and limitations. And what are the consequences of another model of the gene that might then come either to displace the gene model or to problematize it in various ways? Scientists must be rhetoricians, not because they're not serious scientists, but precisely because they are serious. And I think that one of the things that our discipline is going through is this sense of seriousness coming from the full realization of the depths to which science really is rhetorical. I delight to see that. It's great to live to see this day.
Sure. You've already hinted at the answer to this question, but I wonder if you could elaborate perhaps on another theme. What does rhetoric add to studies of science, technology, and medicine? And you've hinted at the role of figuration and style in argument. Do you want to say a little more about that, or is there another term in rhetoric?
Well, yes, I would like to add one thing. It adds a sense of public, and it adds a sense of civic responsibility. Language isn't just something you use. Language isn't just strategic. Language is also constitutive. It is through language that we not only indicate things, but we constitute identities. So when a doctor takes communication problems seriously, it isn't just to aid or make his practice more efficient, though that may be part of the motivation, particularly in our time. But if that medical practitioner is in dialogue with someone from our subdiscipline, that person will realize that the communication practice he or she is interested in comes at a cost. That means being a physician of a certain kind. That means running an office in a certain way. That means representing the person and not seeing only the disease. That is substantive, and it is rhetorical, and it is civic, and it takes seriously the audience. And it is not simply about manipulation or, as they say in so much of the social science literature, compliance gaining. Yes, we want good outcomes. They should be measurable. But we also recognize that part of the good outcomes is a deepened self-understanding on the part of the patient that can't be cured, and the part of the physician that may see the limits of his art, but not the limits of his or her responsibility to that patient.
Could you say a couple of words about the role of invention in the Rhetoric of Science? As I recall, your contribution to the Rhetorical Hermeneutics volume relied on that quite a bit. And you can riff off of that in particular or update that a bit.
Well, I'm just particularly delighted at this conference because we've featured invention, and Lisa Karanen deserves so much credit for taking that as the theme and for organizing these papers on it. One of the great delights I've taken in my study of Darwin that I would enjoy just as an episode in my life is coming to see how Darwin came on his own ideas through the sense of play. There are many interpretations of Darwin's notebooks, as there are historians of science. One of the things that runs through any fair reading of Darwin's notebook is the play of his own mind, the willingness to try out a metaphor, the willingness to follow a dead end before he realized it was dead, and then the ability to pick up something from that and then to move on, to something else. And you go into his notebooks, and he's similarly, self-critical. And then I think it's in Notebook C, he begins to, this is before he comes on natural selection, but he thinks he's got this theory of evolution, without natural selection. And it's very much like Lamarck's, in many of its respects. And he's answering objections. Remember the case of the astronomers, and blah, blah, blah. And he gives himself an argument, be sure to say blah, 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 blah. And then he's even got some theological, arguments, that his is a much more beautiful and nobler view of the deity, than the competition. And so it's great to see in a first-class mind, in a mind which has survived its century. Marx and Freud are so 19th century. Darwin is still so 21st. He is still with us, our concern with the environment, our aware of the web of life, the tangled bank image that begins, or that ends, the final paragraph of The Origin. To see that mind at play, and to see the substantive role of reflection on communication as part of the way in which he came to his ideas. Once you've had that experience, you never see rhetoric the same again. Because you recognize we have a figure for it. It's called an oxymoron. You recognize how serious play is, and how playful one needs to be in order to be serious. And I think the tension between innovation and self-reflection, the willingness to try out ideas and then to make fun of himself, and to engage in conversation with his peers, people with whom he could not speak, to whom he could not speak about his theory, but he can speak to them on the page, and to see him take trains of argument of his colleagues, and, well, how would you work this one? You could say, and he's engaging in a dialogue he cannot have in person at the cost of his yet-to-be-made reputation. He can have, through the serious play of his notebooks, a conversation he could not, and then you read The Origin and you can hear the echoes. You can hear the voices of his colleagues speak through the volume, and you can remember how long this conversation is going on, and it raises new questions about what is it to be an author. And you realize what a significant contribution those who opposed Darwin played in the very formulation of his thought. And you really see in this process science in an entirely different light, because it not only concerns professionalization, which Darwin was not in his time. Huxley's generation was the generation of the professional science. But you see science deeply in touch with its culture. You see science still speaking the language of religion, having to deal with it. You see science speaking the language of politics. You see science speaking the language of the street. And you recognize how many forces go together, scientific and cultural, literary and religious, go into making a scientific idea. So I came to see Darwin as one and many, and I've never forgotten that lesson.
So moving from Darwin's notebooks and Darwin writing in the heyday of print in many ways, do you care to speculate a bit about how the rise of the internet provides a kind of opening for rhetoricians of science?
Well, I'm delighted to see it, and this is something that happened during my lifetime, but is still forming me, you know, for various reasons. I have had to have a website of my own, in part to get control of my own brand. If you end up, for good or ill, on someone's, if you end up on someone's ill will list, you will never erase that from the internet, irrespective of the complexities of the case. And as someone who remains an academic and who, in his local sphere, plays the role of politician, at least on a school board level. Hey, it's the lowest office to which you can aspire, and I aspire there, you know, and have done it twice. I'm a slow learner. You recognize anybody can contribute or detract from your reputation. And anyone can take something you've said in a context you thought you understood, or something you've done in a context you thought you understood, and give it an entire meaning that may shock you. And rhetorician, you need to practice your art, and especially in the age of the internet, you need to be very careful of your associations. And you also need to be careful, you mean to be mindful and hopeful of the possibilities of redefinition, of coming back at the bastards and having another go. So I think the internet is a great source of democratization. It gives people, from my home, I can do what once I had to travel to Cambridge University to the rare books room to do. These hands have touched, you know, Darwin's original documents, the letters, the books, et cetera, et cetera. You can see some of the same marginalia, not all of it, but you can see some of the same marginalia that I had to go to England to see on the internet. Anyone can access this. I think that's wonderful. There is, of course, a downside. You know, as Jeannie Vandenstock pointed out today, you can make your own fake scientific journals. And they have, you know, and so there are it introduces great possibilities for civic knowledge. It introduces great possibilities for representative government. Every totalitarian regime that's left fears the internet and seeks to control it. Exhibit A has to be China. You know, we can take some comfort and hope, you know, from the Arab Spring. And there's also downsides. You can have your reputation shredded, you know, no matter whether you deserve it or not. Fakery has got new horizons that just won't quit. But I think also citizens have new means of empowerment. And as one who would aspire, and has always aspired, to be a civic rhetorician, I have to take the side of the people on this. And so, is this an instrument that empowers the people? I believe it is. So with all its limitations, and I bear in my body some of the scars of them, with all its limitations, I think this is a good thing.
We've reached our final question, which is, what future directions, either topically or methodologically, do you see or would you recommend for the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine research?
Well, I think that issue has been very well addressed by our conference today, and I would just refer viewers of this video, if it survives into the future, to take a look at Jeannie Fainstock's paper. I think she's given a wonderful overview of topics. This is actually a way of addressing, so what do I personally think? One of my resolutions is that I really want to be able to use the internet the way Jeannie did. Because, and I'm prepared to trouble the lives of local librarians if that's what it takes. Because I want to learn how you access these various sources so that I too can find out. There are exactly 1,564 references to rhetoric in the in the history of the journal Science. The journal Nature has 4,654. 2/3 of those are in favor. You see what I'm trying to talk. But also, it is through the ability to dialogue with different communities of interest that we discover our subject matter. I think that as new citizens' interest groups, whether they are about medicine, whether they are about technology, or whether they are about various issues that create an intersection from these things, that the ability to access, to know how to intelligently inquire using the internet is going to be a great boon for our studies. And I hear so much about data mining. It's just a term to me. But the ability, we complain for so much of my own 40-some year career about information's exploding. We can't master it. Well, it looks like we can, and that we may be able to retrieve information and make use of it. And I think this is a great thing. So without going on in great detail, I'll just mention, I think there are opportunities for citizen science, which my own humble example that I sort of waded into, shall we say, is one instance of topics that will become increasingly important in an age defined by not only the internet, but access to it, and by a citizenry that knows how to use it as a tool of inquiry.
I wonder if you would indulge me with one more question. Do you have any sage advice for young rhetoricians working in this field? What would you say to someone thinking about dipping their toes into the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine? What is one ingredient in the recipe for success?
You can form your own path. I really do believe that one of the most attractive features of the rhetoric of science is that you can invent your own subject area. The downside is exactly that. You may pick something in which there is no expertise, or only we've got maybe a couple of generations of expertise, but there is no one subject. So you can still pick a topic and form an aspect or a subfield of study around that topic. This is a degree of freedom rhetoricians have always enjoyed. And I think it is one of the strongest motivations for a person of liberal sensitivities that is also an epistemic entrepreneur. This is a discipline or a subdiscipline in which you can come in, and if you have the willingness to invest your time, if you have the willingness to dialogue with your colleagues at meetings such as this, you may very well discover an area that is not well researched and that involves important issues of, well, all the issues that matter, right? Self-governance, information, distinguishing the better from the worse, all the topics of deliberation, the expedient, the inexpedient, the noble, and the base. And so I think that the rhetoric of science remains an open frontier for people, young people, of vision and of courage.